So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today on this session on embedding learning in a post-COVID world. Thanks for giving up your time. We won't keep you any more than an hour. And yeah, we're going to be talking about embedding learning, which is nothing new. Let's be honest. It's always been a challenge in L&D. It's just even more of a challenge now with what is essentially a much more remote working environment, which is making it a lot more challenging. There's less support for our learners. Less chance for us to follow up because we're not seeing people as regularly, and certainly less collaboration between peers in terms of L&D as well as work in general. So we're going to cover a few things on that. We're going to take a quick look at 70-20-10, the history of that and its relevance in today's world. We're going to look at what learner needs are, what they are now, what they might be like in the future. And then in particular, we're going to be looking at spaced repetition theory and how that can solve some of those problems. We're going to look at the science behind it, and then we're going to talk about how we've applied it with some case studies and showing some of the results that we've had, that we've seen ourselves. So Paul and I will be sort of taking turns talking through some of that. Please feel free to jump on the chat and ask any questions, or open your Q&A, your question and answer box from your toolbar. Feel free to fire off questions. We'll try and answer them during the session. If not, we'll get them at the end. So feel free to ask any questions you've got, but there will be a time for questions at the end as well. So, and of course, the session is being recorded, so that will get sent out to all of you guys afterwards. If you miss anything or want to capture anything afterwards, you'll get a chance then. So, just very brief intros before we go any further. And so, as you can see, my name is Tony Manwani. I'm the director and co-founder of People Unboxed. And so my history is largely in the corporate world. I worked for McDonald's restaurants for 20 years. Some of that time managing restaurants and groups of restaurants, but largely in the L&D department, looking after digital learning, but also classroom learning, designing end-to-end programs for 100,000 employees. And we set up People Unboxed just over 2 years ago now. And to be honest, spaced repetition was one of the first things we looked at, but we offer end-to-end L&D and employee engagement solutions. And I'm joined today by Paul Westlake, or Westy, so I'll let you say hello.
Thank you very much. Yep, cheers, Tony. Yeah, hi, everybody. My name's Paul Westlake, or Westy, as most people would know me on social. I'm digital director at People Unboxed. Very similar to Tony in terms of work history. I worked at McDonald's too for 26.5 years, the last 10 years of which I was working in the L&D department, designing and delivering predominantly face-to-face training. And then in the last 5 years, I was bringing McDonald's kicking and screaming into a world of digital. So procuring an LMS system, as well as sort of finding and writing our own digital learning, e-learning, video work, that sort of stuff. And when I left there, which was just over sort of 6 or 7 years ago now, I joined Kineo, which was one of the biggest digital learning providers in the UK. And I worked there as a solutions consultant. So my role there was very much designing learning or digital learning solutions for the likes of Compass Group and Rolls-Royce and McDonald's and numerous companies. And then I joined Tony at People Unboxed just over a year or so ago now, to sort of focus on our digital offering. And as you can imagine, in where we are right now in the world, it wasn't a bad move at all for any of us, because digital seems to be very much the way many things are going. Whether that was through choice or not, I don't know. But yeah, that's where we are now. So I'm digital director here, looking after all manner of digital offerings from People Unboxed, but also offering sort of a lot of the face-to-face stuff that we used to do in the past. So bringing everything together, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So we'll get started. And first of all, we thought, let's look at 70-20-10 for the 20s. What's it all about? And actually, if you Google learning in the 20s, you actually get this. So this is what we got. And it's ironically, although it looks really ancient, it's probably not changed as much as you might think. We've still got that learning in classroom, that formal delivery, that 10% traditional formal learning. We've got the 20% learning from others, whether that's in groups or from media. And we've still got the 70% that's learning by doing in the job, in the role. So, you know, it's been around a while, learning in that way, even though it wasn't sort of seen in that way. And the model, the 70-20-10 model, wasn't formally published until 1980. And that was actually derived from some research at the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina back in the 1980s. Obviously, it's very commonplace now. People are very familiar with 70-20-10. And I think partly because it's a very straightforward model, regardless of what you're learning, whether it's doing accountancy training, something really formal, or something informal like learning to drive, it's still completely relevant. So 10% of that being classroom or textbook or whatever it might be. So that formal learning. So in terms of the driving, for example, could be the highway code, like learning how to do things. 20% working side by side with someone. So in the case of driving, it's driving instructor. And then 70% from sort of in-role, so basically practice driving. And we all know that's where we do most of our learning, is by practicing and doing things. You know, I'm sure we'll all admit that when we learned to drive, when we passed our test, we probably weren't the best driver. We learned over time. And in fact, whoever did loads of driving at night or parking in a multi-story car park, there's certain elements you don't learn until you're in that role. So, you know, it's always been true that 70-20-10 plays a big part in learning. But obviously in recent years, technology has transformed the way we learn. And with that, the whole question comes in, is 70-20-10 still relevant?
Well, is it? That's a good question. So if you look on the screen there, so we've got some examples there of what I would consider to be sort of modern learning or modern digital learning. So compliance e-learning course, we've got an explainer video, maybe some mobile learning or mobile learning app. And then we might collaborate via Teams as we are now, or Zoom or Slack. We have learning management systems, and now they've expanded out to be learning experience platforms. And also we've got this idea of spaced repetition, which is something we're going to cover today. Now, I think it's fair to say, if we think about any of these things, which bucket do they fit in terms of the traditional 70-20-10? It's quite easy to make a case for them to fit into any of those buckets. So if we take compliance e-learning as an example, some could argue that that's formal, and therefore that would fit in the 10%. Others would say, well, yeah, but that was written by someone else and it's there for us to learn from others. So it could be seen as learning from others. Or in terms of just-in-time training, the smaller bits of e-learning that we have, you could almost argue that that's sort of on the job. So it could probably fit into any of those three traditional, in quotes, brackets. And in reality, it probably spans across them all. Now, let's not get too hung up on that, because in reality, that is absolutely fine. It simply means that digital learning's short, precise, relevant, shareable training content might be ticking more than one of the boxes at once, which again, it's got to be a good thing. But the point is, it doesn't really matter if we can clearly define into which bucket things fit these days. You know, it could again be across one of the three or all of the three. The important thing to remember is, though, that digital learning, any of the ones you can see on the screen there, they're ticking all of the boxes, and therefore, in some respects, they're giving the L&D team what they desire, which is why they design in this way. But more importantly, they're giving the user what sort of they want as well. Now, when you think about digital learning, there's an awful lot of sort of buzzwords going around. So, you know, if you Google digital learning or e-learning, you know, we get a lot of these: mobile this, AI that, machine learning the other. The thing to understand is that they're all ways to provide and deliver learning, or to enable social sharing and interaction, or in some cases, a way to provide the user with an experience from which they can sort of explore and learn. So working together, all of these different things, doesn't really matter what they're called or what label you put on them, but working together, they are still ticking the traditional 70-20-10 boxes. They give learners what they want, and hopefully they keep the L&D purists happy too. So is 70-20-10 still relevant? We would argue yes. The problem with 70-20-10 is that people often just see it quoted as it is on the screen here, which looks in some respects like a ratio, or it could be misrepresented as a formula or a goal. I mean, in some ways, it almost looks like, if you imagine making a cocktail recipe, it's 70 of this and, 2 lots of this and 1 lot of this, and that's how it looks. But we shouldn't see 70-20-10 like that. 70-20-10 is not a model of what should be. It's not a formula that should be designed to either. So as an L&D team, you shouldn't be thinking, how are we going to tick the 70 box or the 20 box or the 10 box? For example, you wouldn't necessarily assign 70% of your time, effort, and money to on-the-job interventions, which is the 70. And you probably shouldn't give 20% to the social learning side of things, and perhaps 10% on formal training. Ironically, most of the companies that I've worked with in the past, and most of the companies we continue to work with today, spend a majority of their training budgets on that 10% formal. So it certainly isn't only 10% of the budget going towards that. So, in some ways, the 70-20-10 is a bit confused, but only if we see it as an absolute, and it shouldn't be seen like that. Similarly, we shouldn't mandate that our target audience aligns its learning to according to these proportions either. So that's very much missing a 70-20-10 point. They shouldn't be spending 70% of their time doing one thing and only 10% doing another. It depends on what they're learning, and it also depends on the learner and how they learn. So learners are already doing this. Learners are already using 70-20-10, as I said, very much depending on the way they choose to learn. The point is that 70-20-10 is a model or a reflection of, ideally, ultimately, what is actually happening already. So our target audience does take 70% of its learning on the job, 70% of its learning on the job. It does spend 20% of its time interacting with others, and about 10% of their time is spent off the job or thereabouts doing what we consider to be this formal training. So it doesn't judge what's right and wrong. It simply states this is what's happening. Now, for us as a L&D provider, and for people on the call today who are L&D teams that are writing learning, knowing what is actually happening and how our learners actually learn has got to be a good thing. It means we can design solutions that are meeting sort of the wants and needs of our learners, which ultimately, is a bit of the holy grail of training, especially if they then go ahead and actually do it. So with a move more towards remote or just-in-time or digital solutions, we tend to see the edges of those percentages blurring even more. So I've sort of taken the 70-20-10 model as it was and maybe updated it a little bit for how it could look in 2020. So let's have a look at that. Cheers, Tony. Thanks. So I think the big change here is it was still broken into 70-20-10. So we've got the formal training, the learning from others, and the sort of what we call learning all the time. So this is the continuous learning, never stop learning in the flow of work, if you like. The big change is a 70% sector, and it very much reflects that learning in the flow of work, the continuous piece. The systems or platforms that we use, on the whole, are generally irrelevant. So long as they serve up what a modern learner wants to continue to grow, then that's absolutely fine. So I'm not going to say you have to use this platform or you have to use this system. And in fact, when we talk about one of our systems a little bit later on, this is just giving you an idea of what's possible. So we still continue to set a strong foundation. That's your 10% at the bottom there. And we let people learn from each other with social learning or through MOOCs or communities of practice. And there's an awful lot of benefit in doing exactly that. And at the moment, we continue to do that via Zoom calls or on Slack or with Teams. So just because no face-to-face, it doesn't mean we still can't have those collaborations. And then we provide the performance support tools that people need to improve, to gain knowledge, to learn additional skills. But those things are there as and when they want it. So if you think of the formal learning as the foundation and the starting point from which your experiential and the social learning can develop. So if your formal learning foundation is solid, that experiential and social learning that follows is likely to be more active and successful too. But you discard that at your peril. You've got to have that sort of baseline. Here's the groundwork, if you like. Now we can build on top of that. Okay, so let's look at what we talked about learners and what modern learners want and need. So let's have a look at that. So our experience has shown that the way employees want to learn is very much changing and has continued to change over the last few years. So they want things that are bite-sized. They want training that's maybe relaxed and they can learn at their own pace, which is ironically very relevant at the moment. They want things on the go. They want self-initiated. They want to pull training when they want it, not have it pushed to them and forced upon them. Ideally, things should be fun and to a certain extent gamified. That doesn't mean childish or or dumbed down. That means, maybe a bit of competition in there, maybe some simulations within there. They also want things that are personalized. So don't give me the same bit of training as Tony, even though we may be learning the same topic, because that doesn't take into account our previous experience or maybe the way we learn. So let's make it personalized for people. They want it to be impactful though, and it's got to have big impact for little effort. So, they want the right training at the right time, but exactly where they need it. And with remote working on the rise, it was pre-pandemic, if I'm honest, and COVID-19 has just caused that to accelerate even faster. So again, even more so is the one-stop shop, bite-sized, personalized, just when I need it. It's more relevant now than it's ever been. And it's not just us that think that. Tony, do you want to go on to the survey? So I'm sure many of you would have seen this before. If not, this by a quick introduction, this is the latest global sentiment survey that sort of the What's Hot survey that Donald H. Taylor puts out at the start of each year. So the L&D community basically are asked one question: what do you think is going to be hot in 2020? Now, I would add the caveat right now is who knew what was going to happen in 2020? I don't think anybody anticipated what we've had. However, it's interesting to see that the L&D teams were interested in getting involved with learning analytics. So learning analytics allows us to look at learning behavior and then personalize or adapt delivery based on that. They're the top two things that came out of this poll. Micro learning is in there. Performance support and mobile delivery are all there again. So, it's not just us that think it, the teams themselves are actually asking for it. Okay, so in summary, is 70-20-10 absolutely right for the 20s? Well, yeah, I think so. We need to provide a foundation in educating the basics, as we've said. It's the 10% at the bottom there. Structured training, some programs maybe. We then enable exposure to others with sort of similar challenges, and we get people to talk about problems that they've faced through others and work together through that in the 20%, and provide a range of experiences that enable our learners to try out things and learn as they go for the experiential learning. So the key for us is to understand that things take time to embed fully. So people can learn, and people can learn through experiential learning, but they're not going to walk away and be an expert on something. People forget, as I'm sure we're going to come to in just a second. So it's only through repeat practice with timely, relevant feedback along the way do the sort of the ideas that you've built at the 10% formal build through to people actually using that on their day-to-day work on the 70% at the top there. The key for us is to understand how to embed. The biggest issue that we've identified, or we find time and time again, is that many L&D teams tend to overlook that embedding issue, that embedding fact. And we tend to sign training off as complete after the education phase. So Tony used an example earlier of learning to drive. I would argue that his driving instructor told him he could drive the second he passed his test. Was he a great driver then? Well, I know Tony quite well, and I'm not saying he's a great driver now, but let's assume he has his knowledge improved, have his skills improved since then? Absolutely they have. But officially, he was signed off after the 10%. I think in a lot of cases, we assume because we've put that 10% in place, the 70% will just sort itself out and look after itself. Now, we're going to challenge that today. And I think we can't assume that anymore. We have to think of a way of how to embed that knowledge. So, Tony, give us a hand with that.
Right, thanks, Paul. And I didn't know you were going to verbally abuse my driving, so you won't be getting any lifts anywhere else. Yeah, absolutely. So I think Paul's talked a lot about the 70-20-10 and the way it's shaped now. And the one thing that strikes me is, as Paul said, the biggest thing is how do we embed this learning? It's always been the biggest challenge that I've seen is getting return on investment for any training we've done, and making sure that learning's embedded and applied back in role. I've never seen it, well, rarely have I seen it done really, really well. And when I think about even just going to, what's available to the corporate world, and because I went to these exhibitions, so, fantastic World of Learning exhibition, and Sarah, sorry if I mentioned another one, but like Learn Tech as well, I used to go to every year. But from the other side of the fence, not as a supplier, went there with my corporate hat on. And there's always been lots of options around, how, the 10%, the formal learning. So whether it's e-learning or even the platforms that we deliver it via, there's loads of LMSs and LXPs available and things like that. But in my opinion, I haven't seen as much on how do you embed that and make it last. And that is the biggest challenge, is, as Paul said, people forget things. So, that is the biggest challenge we're trying to fix. And if you think that goes back to think about when you were, most of you would have been at school or at university and doing exams, and you'd have sat up with that textbook and loads of cans of Red Bull trying to cram as much information into your head as you could at the last minute, knowing that you might just scrape through the exam tomorrow, but you wouldn't be confident that information was going to stick in your brain any longer than that. And even you think about it more recently, and think about, if I asked you all to just think now about the last course you attended, the last course at work, training course you did at work, and think about how much of that information do you still remember? How many of those leadership models could you tell me about and how they should be applied? And the likely answer is that, you don't remember all of that information or even much of it. And that's not surprising, because, what we know about the human brain tells us that's difficult. So it's not your fault. You can blame biology. Conserving energy has been essential for human survival since the dawn of time, and it back then it allowed us to be more efficient in searching for food and shelter and avoiding predators and things like that. And as a result, our brains quickly forget the stuff we don't use regularly. It saves that space for things we need. So, if we don't use it regularly, we forget it. But we still continue to ask learners to sit through these long classroom courses or online courses and fully expect them to retain all that information and apply it, even though we put minimal effort into supporting them into embedding that knowledge. And we know that only 12% of employees apply the new skills they learn from L&D programs into their jobs. And that was a survey done by 24/7 Learning, cited in the Harvard Business Review. And I think we would all recognize that as probably being quite a realistic statistic, in that, trying to get people to apply things that they're learning is the big challenge. And that's where hopefully, and we believe, spaced repetition can really come in to help us learn not to forget. So spaced repetition is certainly not a new way of learning. It's an age-old psychology. It goes back to the 19th century, 1885, where Hermann Ebbinghaus conducted a series of memory experiments and investigations to sort of test how memory lasted over a period of time. So he set himself a task of trying to memorize meaningless syllables and testing himself periodically to see how many he remembered. So he set himself all these challenges to see what he could remember. And the result was this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So he discovered that his memory decayed very quickly at first. And there's been a lot of modern studies that have replicated these experiments since. And the average results show that we get 50% of new information within an hour of learning it, we would forget. And up to around 70% within 24 hours. So it's quite high statistics, it's quite high numbers that we start to forget very quickly. So anything between 50 and 70% within a day. And that leads to that 12% being only 12% being applied in role, because people forget things, they can't use them. Which obviously presents a problem for all L&D teams, because that's our whole challenge, is to try and change that. So critically though, he found that the rate at which he forgot things could be slowed down by repeating that learning at different intervals. And that's the whole basis for spaced repetition. Exactly like it sounds. So it's repeating at different spaces. So putting information at set intervals that allows us to overcome that forgetting curve. So you can see on the slide here, where if we repeat at certain intervals, and they are starting to space out more regularly over time, that curve just gets flatter and flatter. And yes, we still forget some of it, but it starts to stick with us. And what we see is that it starts to exercise our brains, and it becomes more muscle memory and increases our knowledge retention. So it's a bit just like riding a bike, really. I haven't ridden a bike for 25, 30 years, and I'm pretty sure I still could. if you do something enough over a period of time, then it sticks with you and helps you to embed that knowledge and transfer that knowledge. So that was Ebbinghaus. And then quite a long time after that, Sebastian Leitner, in the 1970s, took space rep a step further and created a technique to actually utilize space repetition. So he created these flashcards and boxes. So his initial boxes were 1 centimeter in size, 2 centimeters, 5, 8, and 14. So they're all different size boxes. And he had these flashcard questions and answers, and the ones he didn't know got pushed back from box 1 gradually to box 5. And the ones he did know came forward into box 4, 3, 2, 1. So sorry, I've said that the wrong way around. The ones he didn't know came to 1, the ones he did know went to 5. Because basically the box size defined how often he reviewed those cards. When a certain section became full, he would review those cards again. So the ones he didn't know very well, he repeated more often. So, and then that spaced out over time. So the ones he knew really well, they still repeated, but not as often. So relevant to his own knowledge and experience, it changed how often he revisited those flashcards and that information. And then he also tried a couple other different methods. He also tried this one where it went forward 1 step each time and then back all the way back to the beginning if he ever got anything wrong. There's a couple of different ways he did this. So he tried different things. The great thing about technology is we don't have to stick to one of those. We can use all of that information. Technology and AI allows us to create those complex algorithms that doesn't just base where those flashcards go based on our last one single answer. It can look over a period of time, how we've responded to knowing something over a longer period of time and spot trends about what we're learning and how we're learning and adjust when we revisit those questions or that learning content at a spaced interval that's going to help flatten that curve. So hopefully you can see, so the whole principle is the things that you don't know very well, are repeated to you more often until you do start to learn them. And then the things you do know are spaced out further apart. So is it still relevant today? As I said, absolutely. It's being used quite commonly for language learning. So if anyone's tried to learn a new language through Duolingo or something like that, they quite often use spaced repetition. So you'll have seen if you've got a word wrong in your French test on Duolingo, there's every chance you're going to get that exact same word come back the very next day because it will be fresh in your mind, it will stick, and you'll remember it the second time. And then maybe it's only 2 days later you get it, and then a week later, and it starts to stick. But the ones you get wrong initially, first day, come back the next day probably. And then the ones you knew are spaced out longer. And that's the principle those work with. So it's already happening with language learning. Medical students have used it for quite a while as learning because they've got so many different things they've got to know off the top of their head. But space rep has been less used by corporate L&D, although it has started to grow over recent years. And another reason why it's really important at the moment for people to have that instant recall of information is that our customers are starting to have it. So, our customers have information at their fingertips more than they've ever done before. And, technology has upskilled them. They can go to a website, they can go to an app, they can find out information. And what that means is, comparatively, any employee of your business is less knowledgeable than they were before. Why would a customer come to you or your employees for help unless they're talking to an absolute expert? If they ask a person in your organization for support and they say, yeah, okay, let me just go away and check that for you. Well, if the customer could have checked that themselves on the website, where's the value add for that employee? So by them having that instant recall and that knowledge at their fingertips can really impress the customer and give us that competitive advantage in that value add piece. So it's even more important. So we really believe spaced repetition can help to improve that knowledge retention, that instant knowledge recall, to help them in their role, but also dealing with customers as well. So there's two sides of it where it can really make a big difference. So that's, I guess, the sciencey bit behind spaced repetition. And, I've always been a massive fan of spaced repetition. And as I said, working in McDonald's L&D team for quite a while, I looked at spaced repetition extensively there because I thought it was going to be so valuable for McDonald's and their teams, where they need to know cooking procedures, times, temperatures, all those sort of things. I just knew it would be so helpful. And there are a handful of suppliers out there at the moment. We are just one of them now, and our offering is called Memory Box. So what I want to do is talk you through how spaced repetition can be used within an app that is practical, and just talk through some of the results we've seen with our clients as well. So, that's difficult. All that science lessons over. It's now simple 1, 2, 3. And the way we see it is just daily workouts. So these 2-minute workouts where people go through some questions. It's like just a fun daily quiz for them, essentially, where they answer 10 questions. And there's no pressure on it. It's self-assessed. No one's going to judge them if they get it wrong. They're learning while they're doing it. And they're exercising their brains in a fun way. So they get the question, they then reveal the answer, and they assess how confident they were not how confident, but how well they knew the answer. So either they absolutely knew it, it rang a bell, or, they didn't know at all. They'll assess how well they knew it. And that's doing 2 things. Right there, that's doing 2 things. First of all, they're learning the answer. It's going to stick with them for the next time they see it, if it comes back soon enough. And the second thing it's doing is the AI is learning from them. So it's a 2-way street. The system is learning what they know and what they don't know, and assorting basically in that lightness style box where that question is going to come back. Is it coming back tomorrow or next week? And based on all the different answers they get, it starts to shuffle those flashcards around, those questions or that learning content around in a way that's relevant for this learner. And that's where the personalization comes in that Paul was talking about, it being so important. So if Paul and I were both studying the same subject, even though we have the same questions in that question bank, we are going to have a completely different learning experience every single day, because what I know is not the same as what Paul knows. My knowledge gaps are not the same as his. So we will have completely different questions every single day, and a completely personalized learning experience to close our own knowledge gaps over that period of time. So that's how it works. And then once but it's literally 2 minutes a day, just fun, 10 questions, bang, nice and simple. And then we have quizzes when they're ready, where people can choose when they think that their knowledge is at the right level, they can go in and take the quiz. There's other ways we've done that. So we can either have it completely open, or we can set it so that once they're regularly achieving a certain level of competence in the fun daily workouts, the quiz unlocks for them. So it only opens when they're ready to take it. So there's different ways we can do that, but essentially there's an end of module assessment to check their knowledge is at where it needs to be. And then probably most importantly at the moment, the leaderboards functionality. So, we've got rewards, unlockable bonuses, avatars, all that sort of stuff that create that competitive spirit. And at the moment with remote working, where people aren't seeing their friends and their colleagues and having that interaction, this is just a nice way of doing that and building that collaboration through learning. Paul said, there is some elements of gamification. It's certainly not a game, but there are elements in terms of challenging other people on the leaderboard, avatars, pathways that unlock bonuses and things like that. And most importantly, it's impactful. So we are basing the questions on people's own knowledge. So they're learning the things they need to. They're taking assessments when they're ready. And the super users in the organization, or the managers, or whatever role you want to call it, can get all the stats on the engagement levels and the impact it's having on people's learning. We can see how they're scoring in those as they learn that content. And Paul's going to talk to you a bit about that impact now through some of the case studies, the clients we've worked with.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So we're just going to like to run through a couple of quick case studies, and then what we'll do is we'll open up for some questions a little bit later on. And there's been a few questions that have come in. I've answered a couple, and Tony probably will have a look at the chat or start whilst I'm doing that. But just running through the first case study is for TUI, or TUI Retail. So you probably know TUI as a big holiday company in the UK and across Europe, in fact. So this was the challenge that TUI came to us with. So the main challenge they've got, if we boil it down, is that they actually offer almost too much. They've got a huge range of services that they offer, not just an array of holiday destinations that obviously their store staff need to know everything about, or their customers expect them to know about, but also they sell add-on services to things like travel insurance and currency exchanges and car hire and numerous other bits. So the problem they had was that, as Tony explained, the modern customer tends to do a lot of research before they make a purchase. And certainly if you think about booking a holiday, the first place I would start probably wouldn't be on the high street going into a travel agent. So I would start by maybe Googling something or bringing it up and at least having a short list. And it's when I go into that travel agents, I almost want them to add something extra. And this was the problem they had, because customers coming in would expect their sales agents, to be that sort of local insider with insider knowledge of the destinations, to say, oh, I've been there myself, or, oh, did you know that you could do this when you got there? So they needed a way of training their people up to improve their knowledge so that they could become sort of the expert, if you like, which was the key differentiator, which then encouraged the customer to book. And also to help the customer know that they'd made the right choice and they were confident for it. In a lot of cases, people book holidays, 18 months in advance. So it was really important that they had that knowledge and they thought they'd made the right decision. So that was a challenge that TUI gave us. So how did we approach that? Well, yes, they got traditional e-learning, but it was more about embedding. So as Tony's already again alluded to, it's fine doing a piece of e-learning about, I don't know, a winter resort, but if I'm not then going to sell a holiday that's based around that winter resort for 6, 9, 12 months, I'll have forgotten about it by the time I got there. So MemoryBox was actually a really good fit, and we introduced MemoryBox into TUI. Tony, if you want to go to the next slide. So we created a couple of different question banks, or a number of different question banks, for a range of different destinations. So there was one for the Caribbean, one for the Americas, Indian Ocean, that sort of thing, covering topics that help the staff be seen as local experts. So these were things like talk about sort of currency and the culture and that sort of thing about the area, but also maybe places to visit and a little bit more about individual hotels, that sort of stuff. So again, helping the staff be seen not just as someone who's read this off of out of a brochure, but someone who could be seen as a local expert. And what we did is we timed some of those question banks to drop at key points throughout the year. So Tony didn't cover it when he gave you the overview of MemoryBox, but we can actually have sort of focused courses, so we can sort of push something to the top of the list, like a priority course, if you like. And we use that functionality to maybe improve the knowledge on ski resorts prior to winter, for example. So it was fresh in the staff's mind when it came to selling. So, again, we could say, we know this is coming up, here's one that you can maybe refresh yourself on. So we did that sort of like a couple of months beforehand. So it was fresh in the salesperson's mind when they came to sell that holiday. So that's all quite anecdotal at the moment. So let's have a look at some of the facts and figures. Well, the first one that's probably standing out there is the engagement. So 84% of the total estate that the app was available to went on and used it, which was which was fantastic for us. Remember what Tony said, this is all pull, not push. This isn't being forced on anyone. You know, they were made aware that this is here to support you if you want it. And 84% people actually went on and used it. And what was quite nice, we actually saw the same engagement levels across a range of age groups. So it wasn't just like the youngsters wanting to play on their phones, for want of a better phrase. We saw the older generation, as much as the younger ones, getting on, doing their quizzes and using it. And maybe part of that is sort of that 92% easy to use. They said it was accessible, it was fun, it was quick, you know, and it was easy for people to do, and they could see a benefit from doing it. So therefore, why would they not? Now, just covering on the left-hand side there, the sort of quartiles, so quickly explaining that. So once we'd run the pilot, we basically broke people down into sort of different quartiles. So these were the amount of times that people were going on, if you like, the amount of workouts they were doing over a day or across a week.
The quartiles are split based on active users. So the quartile one is the top 25% of active users, and then down to quarter four was the least active users.
Thank you. And then when we looked at the sort of anecdotal stuff, if you like, you know, what was really important for us is 96%. And remember, the whole idea of this is to make people more confident to be able to sell. So 96% of users felt that they had more knowledge, or some degree of knowledge, higher than what they had before they did the system, which is brilliant. And then 74% said it actually made their job easier. They felt more confident to be able to sell more holidays. The initial figures that we got back from TUI suggested that was actually happening. People that had done that were more confident in selling and therefore sold more. So it was competitive, it's fun. Users average 1.7 workouts a day. And it's difficult to quantify, but, you know, figures that TUI shared with us suggest that they think they saved around £250,000 worth of training time versus training in the classroom, just on the amount of workouts people were doing each day. So there's some fantastic figures. And on top of that, as you can see on the screen here, we've also got some anecdotal feedback. You know, really enjoyed the addictive quiz. Great app, much prefer that to sort of e-learning and all the rest of it. So it's fair to say the users didn't really, and when we interviewed these people, they didn't see it as doing learning as such. They thought it was just something that was a bit of fun and they added on, but then it actually improved the way they did their job. So it's a bit of a win-win there. So that's a quick overview of TUI. The second one, a case study we'd like to look at is Dr. Martens. So a team at Dr. Martens used MemoryBox to solve, I guess, a sort of a similar problem that they had, in that they wanted to improve product knowledge in general. They wanted their staff to be experts on their range of shoes. When you get to work with Dr. Martens, you realize they're very passionate about what they sell. They're very proud of their history. They're very proud of, you know, the range of items that they have available. But they wanted they wanted that to come across in their staff. And one of the reasons it wasn't happening in all cases is because those people didn't have that background knowledge, didn't know the history. So it's not just about identifying different types of shoes. They wanted to give their people the knowledge that they were confident in helping a customer find the perfect pair. So they occasionally lost sales, for example, due to something that maybe just didn't quite fit perfectly. And that could have been overcome by suggesting maybe a different type of leather that was maybe slightly softer, or maybe a different style, or even something simple as, you know, suggesting an insole which, reduced the size by half a size. So that sort of knowledge comes with experience over time. Unfortunately, Dr. Martens are one of those retailers where time isn't always on their side. You know, sometimes, certainly when they're going into summer and going into returning back to school time, or going back to their sales time, they have to hire a lot of staff very quickly and get them up to speed with product knowledge very quickly. And that's time they just didn't have. Fortunately, they used MemoryBox for that, and it turned out to be a really good solution. So let's have a look at the numbers on that one, Tony. So again, we created a number of question banks to cover the history of the company and the manufacturing process as well. We covered new ranges to increase knowledge prior to sort of that range launching. So again, that people could hit the ground running. And we also placed a focus on some of the add-ons. So things like the insoles that I've talked about, but also, they sell Dr. Martens socks that are specific for certain types of boots, and also shoe protectors and that sort of stuff to sort of help boost sales. Those bits that tend to get missed when someone sells a pair of shoes. In terms of engagement, we saw 83% engagement from the workforce for Dr. Martens. And that means that 83% of their people who had access were completing at least one workout per day on average. So they were doing their 2 minutes, their 10 questions. Active user scores, again, looking at quartile 1 versus quartile 4, 91% in quartile 1 versus 80% in quartile 4. Now that's all right. That's a lower impact than we saw with TUI earlier, only 11% difference, but it's higher overall. And Dr. Martens tell us that their people were starting with a generally higher knowledge point than maybe some of the TUI guys were. So there's a tangible business case. We saw increased sales conversions. At one point, maybe a victim of our own success, we put a question bank in to emphasize the extras that I talked about. And there was a few questions in there about the insoles and, what people could use those for and explaining, why they were so important. And unfortunately, sales went up so much on those insoles that the suppliers ran out of stock. So maybe we caused a bit of a problem there, but it's a nice problem to have. And again, great figures, but the anecdotal feedback from the staff was great. But what was really pleasing for us as a company was the comments, not just from those staff, but from their managers and from the area managers in particular. There's one in there in particular I'd like to point out, store manager saying, when reflecting on how Memory Box had helped to train new starters in particular, said it completely and utterly changed everything. They were getting new starters in who were using Memory Box, hitting the ground running, and they couldn't believe the amount of knowledge these people had in such a short space of time. So a bit of a whistle stop tour. So there's a couple of examples of how Memory Box has been used to improve product knowledge and increase sales, which I hope, as you can see, it's that's a good use for it, but it could be used for far more than that. Tony, do you want to pick up on that?
I will. Thanks, Paul. And I think one of the big things that came out from all of the feedback we got from learners and the managers was around confidence as much as anything else. So not just the knowledge, but people just felt more confident to talk about the products they were selling. And admittedly, in both these cases, we're talking about sales, but just in terms of, the confidence we have when we know the answer to things is so powerful. And that was one of the biggest things that sort of really came through on the feedback we had. I am going to talk about how we use this, but there was a question I wanted to cover on the chat. There's a question saying, did the TUI staff use their own equipment or company mobiles, and were we able to track if it was done in the working day or in their own time? So they were able to use any device, but TUI were very, very focused on making this a work thing and making sure people were told to do it during their working day. So they made time in the stores just when things were quiet, just to let someone go on there for 2 minutes and have a go. And to the point where all of the communication materials that we created for TUI to share with their staff were all depicted with a desktop device. So it was absolutely available on mobile, but there was a real focus on the fact that this could be done within the store and there would be given time on it. So yes, of course, people will have done it in their own time. We know people did because we saw some of the times it was done, and we saw the split. And I think it was 60% mobile. I'm pretty sure, to answer your question, it was 60% mobile and 40% desktop. Now, some of that might have been mobile on breaks or whatever, or even while working, they might have been able to use their phone. But I'm sure there were a high number of people that just did it on the train home, or when they got home, or late at night, or whatever it might be. And to be honest, we know there was a lot of that in the evening because people were really focused on the competitive leaderboard, so much so that TUI actually asked us to cap the amount of points that the people could get after their first workout of the day. They didn't want them to do lots and lots, and that makes sense because the whole spaced repetition learning principle doesn't need it to be lots of stuff in one day. But they said cap it at 3, no more points. They could do it as many as they wanted, but no bonus points after 3 workouts, and only reduced after the first one. So if you can see the competition that gets driven by having that scoring system. It just makes people want to get on there and learn, and just the fun nature of it. So yeah, I'm just going to cover a couple of last things, I guess. And so learning topics, you probably would think like, what spaced repetition going to be supported? What areas would it work for? And you'd be absolutely forgiven for thinking exactly this: product knowledge and sales, which is the two examples we've just given you. Maybe some process instruction, some compliance learning, absolutely compliance learning. So compliance, we get asked about a lot for this. My answer is always, if you want it to tick a box, and I'm not judging anyone if that is your answer about compliance, then do you know what? Do a piece of e-learning, because in terms of the way this is driven, it's more for, it builds learning. It's not for tracking as much. We can track it, but it's probably easier to have e-learning. If you want people to genuinely understand it rather than just click next screen, then this is perfect for compliance to embed that. Anyway, these are the things that you probably think it's perfect for. It's what we thought it's perfect for from those days when I wanted it at McDonald's, and when we first launched this, we thought this is where it would fit. But to be honest, pretty soon after, we realized that it works for almost anything. So leadership, I talked earlier on about, you probably attended a course and then forgotten some of the stuff you learned. And if I just pick a theory, let's talk about situational leadership model from Hershey and Blanchard, just because it's probably one of the most common ones that people will be familiar with. If I asked, if anyone that learned that model, that situational leadership model, do you go back into role and apply one of those leadership styles immediately? Probably not. And then by the time you need to apply it, a week later, a month later, you've forgotten what the styles are, when to apply them exactly. So we've written questions around, if you've got this type of learner, of employee, what style would you adopt? And they're learning. So they're embedding that learning by answering questions about leadership models. It's not going to make them apply it. It's not going to. But what it's going to do is embed the understanding of that model rather than a quick flash in the course on one day that they forget later. It embeds that understanding so that they've got the confidence to use it later on. So leadership, absolutely, we find really works with this. Really supports induction. You think about it, new starter in a new business, they're thrown a million things to remember at once. This can help that. We're finding this wasn't designed for communication. We're finding people using it for that. Like post a conference, they're launching a question bank to land all those key messages after a conference, to make sure they're really embedded. That stuff that, people spend thousands of pounds on conferences, maybe more, depending on the size of the organization. They want those messages to land, and they're using this to do that. If you want to get an urgent change out there, whether it's a GDPR regulation that changes or a COVID message, whatever it might be, developing a question bank you can do in hours or days at most, compared to e-learning, which we know probably takes weeks and months in sometimes. And then also refresher knowledge. You can turn this content on and off as you like. As Paul said, we targeted certain things with TUI for their winter break holidays. They might only bring them back on every 2 months of every year, but you can just bring it back as a refresher. So we found it works for a lot more things than we thought it was going to. As we said, there's a lot of spaced repetition apps out there. Well, there's not a lot, but there are a handful of them out there. So, hopefully we've given you something to think about in terms of spaced repetitions and using it in general and how it could support your business. Regardless, obviously, we'd love to speak to you about a memory box and our offering, but please go out and have a look. Like spaced rep, we really do believe can make a big difference to embedding learning. Just a couple of things about ours: fully customized and so fully branded. All the scoring and everything is changeable, so it can be completely designed for your organization. And I think one of the important things that I've said before is everything is one. So it's one license for memory box, and then you can put as much content in there as you like for no extra cost. Obviously, we could develop the content at cost for you, but it's so simple to develop yourself and upload. You can chuck as much content in there as you want. You could have all your compliance e-learning supported as to embed. You could have all your leadership. You could have all your functional learning. You could have everything in one place for people to learn and embed their knowledge over time. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found the science and the case studies interesting and just food for thought. Obviously, if you've got any questions, we're going to be around for the next few minutes. You can fire off questions on here. Equally, our contact details are on the screen there, so feel free to drop us a line. This QR code here will give you a free demo on your device. If you'd like to just scan that, you can just register for free. There's a fun version we've created. It's got some fun ones around cocktails and landmarks, but also some other stuff around basic leadership and GDPR, just mini versions of Question Bank, so you can get a feel for how it works from a learner perspective. We are doing a post-COVID sale, so get in touch if you want us, if you're interested in that. There's no minimum sign-up time or anything like that, so drop us a line if you'd like to. But we're here for any questions or anything otherwise.